Humanity's first peaceful contact with another civilization lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. It ended in a diplomatic crisis that no one expected, that no instrument recorded, and that no human being could fully explain. What follows is the account of how it happened and what it revealed about what we are. Captain Elias Verne had spent 22 years negotiating in rooms that wanted nothing from him. Military briefing chambers that smelled of recycled air and stale ambition. Outpost conference halls where the walls had absorbed so many failed agreements they seemed to lean inward with the weight of them. He had learned, in those rooms, that the most dangerous thing a diplomat could do was mistake comfort for safety. The room he sat in now was the most comfortable he had ever occupied. That frightened him more than anything else. It had been designed so that no species would notice it, which was precisely why Elias noticed it immediately. The walls were a muted composite that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The table was perfectly circular, its surface uninterrupted by seams or markings. Even the air carried no scent, filtered to a neutrality that erased any trace of origin. It was a space built to offend no species, and in doing so, it felt as though it belonged to none. Elias rested his hand briefly on the table, half expecting it to feel unreal, but it was solid enough. That somehow made it worse. A room that declared nothing was a room hiding everything. And then, before he had time to complete that thought, the delegation entered, and Elias understood for the first time in his career that he was not the most observant person in the room. There were 4 of them. Their forms were roughly symmetrical to human proportions, but the similarities ended there. Their skin held a faint translucence, as though light moved through it before deciding whether to stay. Their eyes were larger than human eyes, set slightly wider apart, and they carried a soft, internal luminescence. Not a glow exactly, but a quality of depth, as though looking at them was the beginning of looking into something much further away. They moved the way water moves. Not fluidly, exactly. More than that. They moved the way water moves when it already knows where it is going and has never once considered any alternative. Their name, in every official record, was rendered as the Gyclons. The word was an approximation. Most things about them, Elias was already beginning to understand, were approximations. They had brought very little with them. A narrow band of devices rested along their side of the table, each piece smooth and curved, without visible joints or interfaces. Elias had watched one of them adjust the position of a device as they settled, and the movement had been so precise it seemed less like placing an object and more like guiding it into agreement with the surface beneath it. Everything they did carried that quality, an instinct for rightness that made human deliberateness look, by comparison, like fumbling in the dark. He had read their file 3 times before this meeting. The official reports described them as methodical, patient, and unusually receptive to emotional nuance. That last phrase had been underlined in multiple briefings, though no analyst had been able to define what it meant in practical terms. High empathic capacity, the report said. In Elias's experience, that phrase had always meant one of 2 things, polite attentiveness, or something much stranger. He was beginning to suspect the answer was the second. He settled back in his chair, adopting the posture he had spent 22 years perfecting. Open hands, relaxed shoulders, the careful architecture of ease constructed over a foundation of absolute control. He let a moment pass before speaking. Not out of hesitation, out of rhythm. When we first began expanding beyond our home system, he said, we didn't have the luxury of perfection. Most of what we built wasn't designed for the conditions it ended up facing. The translator field rendered his words cleanly. He watched for their reaction. They did not interrupt. They did not shift. They listened with a stillness that felt more complete than silence. Not the stillness of waiting, the stillness of total attention, as though his words were being received and cataloged by something more precise than hearing. We had a station, he continued. Early on, it wasn't meant to last more than a year. Temporary structure, limited shielding, materials that wouldn't pass modern safety standards. But it was what we had, so we used it. He allowed a faint smile, just enough warmth to soften the statement. The engineers knew exactly how inadequate it was. They documented every weakness. They checked every seal constantly. They adapted whenever something failed. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't efficient. But it worked. For 11 months, 334 days, that station held. Not because it was perfect, because the people maintaining it refused to let it fail. He paused, letting the words settle into the room's constructed neutrality. That's something worth understanding about us, he added, more quietly. We make things work, even when they shouldn't. One of the delegates tilted her head slightly. The motion was small, but it carried a quality of attention that made Elias feel, for just a moment, as though his words were being examined from angles he could not see. The one seated directly across from him, the lead delegate, Lyra, though he did not yet know her name, would not know it for another 4 hours, spoke. Her voice, when translated, was clear and precise, but there was an underlying cadence to it, something musical that the translation could not capture, like hearing a song with the melody removed and only the rhythm left behind. You build from limitation, she said. You preserve function through adaptation. Elias inclined his head. That's one way to put it. Her gaze remained on him, steady, unbroken. And in that moment, Elias became aware of something quiet in his chest. Not pride exactly, but something adjacent to it. The feeling of a belief he held deep being spoken aloud and recognized by another mind. At that exact moment, she made a sound. It was soft, almost delicate, a tone that lasted less than a second, perhaps 800 milliseconds, though no recording would later capture it clearly. It did not come through the translator. It did not need to. It carried a resonance that seemed to pass through the room rather than across it, like a vibration felt in the sternum rather than heard by the ear, like something that bypassed the usual channels entirely and arrived somewhere older. Elias kept his expression neutral, but something in the air had shifted, subtle enough that he could not name it and could not dismiss it. That is an efficient approach, she said, continuing as though nothing unusual had occurred. It's a necessary one, Elias replied. The conversation moved forward. Trade protocols were discussed, navigation corridors outlined, communication frameworks proposed. The exchange was smooth, almost effortless. The delegates spoke when appropriate, their contributions precise, measured, perfectly timed. Elias found himself adjusting his own rhythm to match theirs, responding with a clarity that felt sharper than usual, as though the act of being truly listened to had made him more articulate, as though something in their attention was drawing the best version of his thinking to the surface. And yet, the moment lingered. The sound she had made had not aligned with anything he recognized as communication. It had occurred at a point where no response had been required. And this was the detail he could not file away. It had coincided exactly with something he had not expressed aloud. A feeling, not a thought. A feeling. He dismissed the observation as coincidence. There were too many variables in first contact to assign meaning to every anomaly. Still, he noted it. By the time the session concluded, 4 hours and 11 minutes after it began, he felt as though no time had passed at all. The delegates rose with the same quiet grace they had maintained throughout. Their movements, even now, coordinated without appearing rehearsed. Elias stood as well, offering the customary closing acknowledgement. We appreciate your openness, he said. And we yours, Lyra replied. Her gaze held his for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Then she turned, and the group departed with the same soft precision with which they had arrived. Elias remained in the room after they left. The silence returned, complete. The neutrality of the space settled back around him like a fog that had never lifted. He exhaled slowly. Something about the meeting had gone well. He could feel that clearly. The kind of clarity that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the certainty that sits beneath logic, the one that arrives before the analysis and waits patiently to be confirmed. And yet there was something else. A small irregularity. A detail that resisted being filed and forgotten. A splinter of wrongness in an otherwise clean surface. He left the room still turning it over, the way you press a bruise to confirm it's there. By the time Elias reached the observation corridor outside the diplomatic wing, the station had shifted into its artificial evening cycle. The lighting dimmed incrementally along the curved passage, mimicking a sunset no one could see from this distance out. Beyond the reinforced glass, the void stretched clean and indifferent, broken only by the distant shimmer of traffic moving through the outer docking lanes. Lieutenant Mara Ilias was already there, leaning against the railing with a data slate balanced in one hand. She did not look up immediately when he approached. She had that quality, the kind of tactical patience that looked like distraction and was anything but. She was giving him space to speak first, which meant she had already decided she needed to hear what he said before offering anything of her own. "How did it go?" she asked after a moment. "Smooth," Elias said. "Too smooth, maybe." That earned him a glance. Direct. Assessing. That's not usually a complaint. "It's not," he agreed. "Just unusual." She tapped something on the slate, locked it, and set it aside. Mara's version of giving something her full attention. Unusual how? Elias rested his hands on the railing, looking out at the slow drift of lights against the dark. "They listen differently," he said. "Not just attentively. Deeper than that. Like they're receiving something beyond the words." "Culturally?" she asked. "Or physiologically? I don't know yet." A pause. There was a moment. "I said something about early expansion, how we built things that weren't meant to last, and made them work anyway. And right when I was thinking about what that actually meant to me, not saying it, not performing it, she reacted. Made a sound. Not translated. Not directed at me exactly. Just there." Mara's expression shifted. The slight tightening around her eyes that meant she was filing something as significant. "Timing. Exact. Could be coincidence," she said. Without conviction, he noticed. It could be. They stood in silence for a moment. A transport vessel drifted past the viewport, its hull catching the station's amber light in a slow arc. "You think it wasn't," she said. "Not a question. I think I don't like not knowing," he replied. Mara exhaled a quiet breath, something close to amusement, but edged with something more serious. "That narrows it down to everything." Elias allowed a small smile, brief as a match flame. "There's more. They don't just respond to what's said. It feels like they're tracking something underneath it. Not inferred, not interpreted. Direct. Immediate." Mara was quiet for a moment, and this was the kind of quiet Elias had learned to respect, the kind that meant she had already arrived somewhere and was deciding whether to say it. "That lines up with the briefings," she said. "High empathic capacity. That term is doing a lot of work," Elias said. "It usually does," she agreed. He pushed off the railing and paced a short distance, stopped. "If that's what it is, we need to understand the limits of it. Range. Accuracy. Whether it's conscious or automatic. Whether they can turn it off, or whether it turns off for them, or whether there is no off." "You're already thinking operational implications," Mara said. "I'm thinking about variables we don't control," he replied. She nodded slightly. "Then, there's someone on station you should talk to. Dr. Renhavek. Xenosensory research. He's been publishing on cross-species perception models for a few years. Mostly ignored. A beat. That usually means he's either wrong or early." "Set it up," Elias said. "I'll see when he's available." She reached for her slate, then added, without looking up, "They've requested another session. Not just a session, a site visit." That pulled his focus back. Sharp and sudden. "What kind of site?" "They didn't specify," Mara said. The wording was careful. "They want to experience something representative. Not data. Physical context. They said, and I'm quoting from the translation, 'We wish to understand what produces your structures, not only what your structures produce.'" Elias considered that for a long moment. "They want to understand what kind of mind builds what kind of world." "That's how it reads," Mara confirmed. He exhaled slowly. "Then we need options. Civilian, exploratory, industrial. Something that reflects who we are without misrepresenting it." "Define misrepresenting," she said. He didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted back to the void, unfocused. "Something honest," he said finally. "But not misleading." Mara studied him. "Those aren't the same thing." "No," he agreed. "They're usually not." She straightened. "I'll start compiling candidates." A pause. "And Elias. If they really are perceiving more than we think." "I know," he said quietly. She didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need her to. The next morning's request arrived formatted with a precision that left no room for ambiguity and yet somehow managed to feel almost deliberately incomplete. Elias read it twice before passing the display to Mara. She scanned it quickly, her jaw setting just slightly. "They've been consistent," she said. "Context, reasoning, then request. Every time. They're not making demands," Elias said. "They're teaching as they speak." Mara glanced at him. "We're making very sure we understand exactly what they mean." He didn't disagree. "They've studied our records," she said. "Our structures. Our engineering. Our systems of expansion. But they believe those things reflect outcomes, not origins." She tapped the display. "They want to understand what produced us, not just what we've produced. A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, waited. They're not asking for something impressive, Elias said. They're asking for something honest. Those aren't always the same thing, Mara said. No, they're usually not. She shifted her weight. We have options. The Meridian is docked in Bay 3. Explorer class. Multi-species compatible. Built for cooperation and shared research. Clean systems, friendly atmosphere. It's practically designed to demonstrate goodwill. Elias nodded. It's clean. That's the point, she said. It's also curated, he replied. A pause. You think they'd notice? I think they'd feel it, Elias said. And then, more carefully, I think curated is exactly what they're asking us not to show them. Mara pulled up another set of data. Kepler Platform 9, zero-gravity manufacturing hub, produces components for roughly 40% of the outer system's infrastructure. No human presence, fully automated. That tells them what we can build, Elias said. Not why. And the Aurelian, she offered. New commission, deep-range vessel. Every system state-of-the-art. Impressive. Impressive, Elias repeated, is not the brief. The room fell quiet. Longer this time. He rose from his chair and moved toward the viewport at the far end of the briefing room. Below, the station's docking arms extended outward in slow, deliberate geometry. Some of the vessels docked along them were new, their hulls unmarked, reflective, promising. Others bore the visible history of use. Patches, discolorations, structural modifications layered across time like sediment. He kept looking at those. We keep trying to show them who we want to be, he said quietly. Mara turned in her chair. Isn't that what diplomacy is? Sometimes, he said. But that's not what they asked for. He watched the old vessels, the ones that had been repaired more times than they had been built. They didn't ask for aspiration. They asked for foundation. Mara leaned forward slightly. Those aren't always things you put on display. No, Elias agreed. They're usually the things you build everything else on top of. He turned back to her. We're approaching this like a presentation, like we need to impress them. But they're not looking for the polished version of who we are. They're looking for the thing underneath it. What does a complete answer look like? Mara asked. He didn't respond immediately. His eyes moved back to the viewport and settled on something specific. Along one of the older docking arms, the arms that predated the current configuration by nearly 6 decades, a vessel sat in its berth. It wasn't large by modern standards. Its structure was angular, its hull a patchwork of materials that had clearly been replaced at different times and with whatever was available. Even at this distance, the inconsistencies were visible. Sections that didn't quite match. Repairs that had been functional rather than aesthetic. A ship that had been put back together too many times to remember what it originally looked like. It had a name, stenciled in faded lettering along the port hull. The Ardent. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't clean. But it was still there. Mara followed his line of sight, and the silence that followed lasted exactly long enough to confirm what she suspected. No, she said softly. Yes, he replied. That's a decommissioned vessel, Elias. It's not active. It's not representative of current standards. It's representative of how we got to those standards, he said. It's a museum piece. It's a record. She stood now, moving closer. You're asking me to take a first contact delegation into a vessel that operated during one of the most violent periods in our expansion history. That was an active combat deployment for 31 years. That has structural modifications performed under fire, under pressure, under conditions that no current engineering code would sanction. I'm asking you to help me answer their question truthfully, he said. That's not the same thing. No, Elias agreed. It isn't. Mara searched his face for the hesitation she expected to find there. She didn't find it. That vessel, she said slowly, was not designed to be seen the way they would see it. Elias felt a faint echo of the unease he had been carrying since the meeting. The splinter, still lodged, still pressing. No, he said. It wasn't. And you're certain this is the message we want to send? He held her gaze. I'm certain it's the message we've already sent, he said. One way or another. The question is whether we send it honestly or let them find it somewhere else. Authorization took longer than Elias expected, which meant it took less time than it should have. The request moved through the appropriate channels with the usual institutional resistance. Questions about optics, about protocol, about whether a delegation of this significance should be exposed to something that had not been designed for diplomatic visibility. Each objection was valid. Each was noted, processed, and ultimately set aside. The way large organizations set aside valid objections when someone with enough gravity has already decided. The approval came with a single condition: full oversight, complete monitoring, immediate withdrawal authority if anything deviated from expected parameters. Elias read it once, then closed the file. Expected parameters, Mara said from across the room. We're very good at pretending we know what those are. We're good at documenting them, Elias replied. That's not the same thing. She accepted the distinction. The delegation arrives in 2 hours. Route is prepped. Minimal personnel. Environmental systems are stable. A pause. Lighting. Reduced, Elias said. Not full illumination. Mara nodded. I set it to 40% ambient. It felt appropriate. He looked at her. She understood. He realized, even if she disagreed. We can still change the selection, she offered. One last time. No one would question a logistical adjustment. We take them to the meridian. Clean, controlled, predictable. They didn't ask for predictable, Elias said. Mara held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small, quiet nod. No, she said. They didn't. The docking bay had been cleared well in advance. When Elias arrived, the space was quiet except for the low mechanical hum of systems operating in the background sound of any space station, so constant it ceased to be sound and became simply the texture of silence. Overhead lights had been dimmed to 40%, as requested, leaving the bay in a subdued amber glow that softened edges without hiding them. The Ardent occupied its berth with a presence that resisted simplification. From a distance, it might have appeared unremarkable. Up close, it was something else entirely. Its hull was not a single surface, but a history of surfaces, layered over 31 years of deployment. Sections of plating varied subtly in tone, some darker, some lighter, each one the result of a repair or a replacement or an adaptation performed under conditions that did not allow for aesthetics. There were no decorative elements, no attempts at cohesion. Every visible feature served a purpose, and many of those purposes had clearly been decided under pressure. You could see it in the angles, the way certain sections were just slightly off from true, because true had not been available at the time and functional had been enough. Elias stopped several meters from the boarding ramp and looked at the full length of it. He had studied the records. He had reviewed the footage from the ship's long history. None of that translated to standing in front of it. It did not feel like an artifact. It felt like something that had been through something and had not entirely left that something behind. Like a face that has been through grief and does not entirely lose the expression of it, even when it is no longer grieving. Behind him, Mara approached quietly. They're on approach, she said. Elias nodded without turning. A shift in air pressure signaled the opening of the docking field. Moments later, the Gyclone vessel entered the bay. It moved differently than human craft. There was no abrupt mechanical adjustment for gravity or inertia. It simply aligned with the docking position as though it had always intended to be there. Its motion continuous and uninterrupted, the way a word settles into a sentence. When it settled, the sound it produced was minimal, more a change in atmospheric pressure than a noise. The kind of arrival that does not announce itself. Elias watched the hatch. A moment passed. Then it opened. The delegates emerged in the same formation they had maintained through every prior interaction. Lyra stepped forward first, her movements as fluid as before. They crossed the docking platform and reached the edge of the bay, and there they stopped. Elias did not move toward them immediately. He remained where he was, allowing them the space to take in what they were seeing. The shift happened within seconds. It was not dramatic. There was no visible recoil, no overt display. But something changed. The subtle harmony that had defined their movements, that quiet synchronization, that sense of each action flowing inevitably into the next, began to fail. Not collapse. Fail. Like a frequency being interfered with. Like a signal beginning to break up. It was slight. A fraction of delay between steps that had previously been seamless. A hesitation where there had never been one. Elias felt it before he consciously registered it. The way you feel a change in weather before you can name what changed. Lyra's gaze moved across the Ardent, not in broad sweeps, but in focused increments, as though she were processing it piece by piece rather than as a whole. Behind her, one of the other delegates shifted their stance, just enough to break the perfect alignment they had maintained until this moment. Elias stepped forward, closing the distance with measured calm. "Welcome," he said. The translator carried his words cleanly. Lyra turned her attention to him. For a brief moment, her expression remained steady. Then her eyes shifted back to the ship. "This structure," she said slowly, "is not uniform." "No," Elias replied. "It isn't." She took a step forward. The others followed, but not as seamlessly as before. There was unevenness now, a subtle lack of cohesion that had not existed in the neutral space of the diplomatic chamber. They moved closer to the Ardent. The boarding ramp extended downward with a deep mechanical resonance. The sound of older systems, heavier materials, processes that had prioritized reliability over refinement for 3 decades and were not ashamed of it. The sound echoed briefly through the bay before fading. Elias watched the delegates react. Not visibly, not in any way that could be easily documented. But he saw it. A brief stillness. A recalibration. Lyra's head tilted at the same angle as it had during their first meeting, but the quality of the motion was different. In the chamber, it had been curiosity. Here, it was something more focused. Assessment. The kind of attention that does not yet have a verdict. Elias gestured toward the ramp. "This vessel," he said, "is part of our history." The words felt different here than they had in the chamber's constructed neutrality. They had weight here. Context. The kind of context that cannot be manufactured. The delegates did not move immediately. Then, slowly, Lyra stepped forward and placed her foot on the first section of the ramp. The others followed. Deliberately, measured, and no longer entirely fluid. Elias watched them ascend. With each step, the subtle dissonance increased. At the top of the ramp, he paused. An old habit, older than his diplomatic training, older than most of the systems in this ship. He turned slightly, facing the interior before crossing the threshold. A beat, a breath. Then he stepped inside. The delegates followed. And the moment they crossed the threshold, something changed in the air. The interior of the Ardent was cooler than the docking bay, not by design, but by inertia. Systems long inactive retained a different equilibrium, one shaped by metal and insulation and time rather than active climate control. The lighting, drawn from emergency circuits, cast everything in a dim amber that deepened shadows and softened edges. Elias slowed his pace deliberately, allowing the delegation time to adjust. The corridor ahead stretched forward in a straight line, its walls lined with panels that bore the subtle irregularities of repeated maintenance. Here and there, sections had been replaced with materials that didn't quite match the original composition. The differences were small. They accumulated. In 31 years of active deployment, this ship had been repaired 712 times. It had been stripped and rebuilt and stripped again. It had crossed distances that should have made its hull fail, and it had not failed because the people aboard had not allowed it to fail. Nothing here had been designed to be seen. Everything had been designed to work. "This vessel served for over 3 decades, Elias said, his voice carrying evenly through the confined space. It was modified continuously to meet conditions it was never originally built to handle. It operated in environments that exceeded its rated tolerances by significant margins: heat, pressure, radiation, kinetic impact, and each time, the crew adapted the ship, and the ship continued." Behind him, the delegates had stopped. He turned. They stood just inside the threshold, their formation intact but strained. The quiet harmony that had defined their movements was no longer present. Each of them held themselves with a stillness that felt less like composure and more like restraint. Like someone standing very still because the alternative is to run. Lyra's gaze moved slowly across the corridor. Not scanning. Focusing. Her eyes lingered on specific points along the wall, then shifted, then returned, drawn back to those points the way a hand is drawn back to a wound. "The material composition varies," she said. Her voice was still controlled, but the musical quality beneath it, the cadence that the translator always stripped away, was different now. Less structured, like a melody losing its intervals. "Yes," Elias replied. "Repairs. Adaptations over time." She stepped forward. The others followed, but again, not perfectly. A slight delay between each movement, as though something was interfering with their synchronization from below the surface of their awareness. Elias resumed walking. More slowly. This section of the wall was part of the original structure. The plating here has been reinforced multiple times. He reached out, and placed his hand briefly against the metal. Cool. Solid. Unremarkable in the way that all endurance eventually becomes unremarkable. He withdrew his hand and continued. The delegates did not touch anything. Not yet. They moved deeper into the ship, their pace uneven but controlled. The corridor opened into a wider junction, and Elias guided them toward the central passage. As he walked, he became aware of something he could not measure. The faint, almost imperceptible harmonic quality that had accompanied the Gyclons since their arrival, that quiet resonance between them, the sense that each mind was in soft and constant contact with the others, was gone. In its place was something he had no name for. Not silence. Something less than the silence they had arrived with. A dissonance where harmony had been. The vessel saw extended deployment during a period of significant conflict, Elias continued, because the silence felt like a space he needed to fill carefully. Many of the modifications you see were implemented under active conditions. Lyra stopped. Elias halted and turned back toward her. She had moved closer to the wall, her gaze fixed on a section where the metal had warped slightly, a subtle distortion, the result of thermal stress that had long since stabilized. A record of a moment when the temperature inside this corridor had exceeded the ship's rated maximum, and the crew had survived anyway. Her hand hovered a few centimeters from the surface. Not touching, not withdrawing. Her fingers slightly extended, in a position that carried a quality Elias had not seen in any of their interactions. Uncertainty. Not the thoughtful consideration of a deliberate choice, but genuine, unmanaged uncertainty. The kind that belongs to someone standing at an edge they did not know was there. Emissary, he said carefully. She did not respond immediately. Behind her, the other 3 delegates had stopped, their attention fixed on Lyra with an absolute stillness that was different from their usual composure. This was not calm. This was the stillness of people who are afraid of what the next moment will contain. Slowly, and the slowness had a quality of effort to it, as though she were moving against something. Lyra placed her hand against the wall. Contact. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then everything did. Her posture changed instantly. Not gradually. There was no transition. One moment she stood composed, controlled, precise. The next she didn't. Her hand flattened against the metal, fingers splaying as though reacting to something with force behind it. Her shoulders tensed, her entire frame rigid in a way that did not belong to the being who had entered this ship. Her eyes widened, and the luminescence within them, that soft, internal light that shifted subtly even when she was at rest, flickered rapidly through variations too fast to track, like a signal being overwhelmed by interference. Behind her, the other delegates reacted. Not in unison, not with coordination. One stepped back abruptly, the movement sharp and unbalanced. Another made a sound, short, fractured, nothing like the smooth tonal communication that seemed to exist as a second language between them. Something that carried the shape of distress in any language. The third reached toward the second, their hands meeting with a sudden, almost instinctive urgency that had nothing diplomatic about it. Elias did not move. Training held him in place, even as something older and more fundamental than training was telling him something was very wrong. Emissary, he said, more firmly this time. What are you experiencing? Her voice, when it came, was wrong. The structure was still there, the vocabulary, the syntax, but the quality had changed. The fluidity was gone, replaced by something strained and uneven, like hearing a familiar voice through a wall, like something filtering through that was struggling to come through clearly. The heat, she said. Quiet. Too quiet for the size of the room. The pressure. Her hand pressed harder against the metal. Not exploring. Bracing. Emissary, the environment is stable, Elias said, his voice carrying a steadiness he was performing rather than feeling. There are no active systems producing heat or the noise, she said. She wasn't listening to him. Or she was listening, and it wasn't reaching her the way it needed to reach her, because something else was reaching her more powerfully. It does not stop. The cold settled into place in Elias's chest then, slowly and completely. Not fear exactly. Recognition. The recognition of something you did not know you were afraid of until the moment you understood it. Behind her, the others were no longer still. They were shifting, each movement independent, reactive. Their coordination fractured completely now, no longer a group operating in harmony, but 4 individuals in separate distress. A sound filled the corridor. It came from them. All of them. Overlapping. Unresolved. Each tone incomplete. The opposite of the resonant harmonic that had made the room in the diplomatic chamber feel warmer than its materials warranted. This was what that harmony sounded like when it broke. When it was overwhelmed from outside. Elias became aware of his own breathing. Slow. Controlled. Measured against something he could not hear. Lyra, he said. Her name for the first time. A gamble. The act of naming someone in a crisis as a way of returning them to themselves. Lyra, you need to tell me what is happening. The fear, she said. Her voice had dropped to just above a whisper. Not quiet because she was calm. Quiet because what she was experiencing was too large for a normal voice to carry. It is everywhere. Her hand trembled. Not slightly. Not subtly. Violently. As though she were holding contact with something that resisted being held. Something that had been waiting behind that metal surface for decades and had found, in the touch of her hand, a way to come through. Elias reached toward her, and then she pulled her hand away. The motion was abrupt, forceful, as though the surface had burned her, though the temperature in the corridor had not changed by a single degree. She staggered back. The others were already moving. Not with grace. Not with the fluid inevitability that had defined their every action from the moment they stepped off their vessel. With urgency. With imbalance. With something that looked, profoundly, viscerally wrong in a way that Elias's mind kept trying to categorize and could not. They did not speak to him. They did not look at him. They turned and moved down the corridor at a speed that bore no resemblance to the measured precision of their earlier movements, and the sounds they produced, overlapping, dissonant, fractured, were nothing like language. Elias followed immediately. Stop, he said. Wait, Lyra, please. They did not slow. The corridor that had felt controlled, contained, a manageable space, now felt narrow, compressed. Their movements echoed against the walls in ways that seemed to multiply rather than fade. They reached the junction, turned without hesitation, moved toward the exit. Elias followed, his pace increasing. Emissary. The ramp. They descended it at a speed that belonged to panic and nothing else. By the time Elias reached the top, they were crossing the docking bay. Their vessel's hatch was already open, as though it had known they were coming. As though it had been listening too. They entered without breaking stride. The hatch sealed immediately behind them. The ship lifted. No pause. No delay. Gone. Elias stood at the top of the ramp and looked at the empty space where they had been. The amber light of the docking bay was unchanged. The ardent behind him was unchanged. The sound of the station's background systems continued its low, indifferent hum. Everything exactly as it had been, except that he was no longer certain what had just happened. And for the first time since the meeting ended, since any of this had begun, he was no longer certain it had been a misunderstanding. The message arrived before Elias had fully left the docking bay. Mara intercepted him halfway down the corridor, moving at the pace she used when she needed to appear calm and wasn't. She handed him the data slate without speaking. He read it once. Then again. The formatting was precise. Formal. Structured according to every protocol expected of an advanced civilization engaged in diplomatic communication. That made the content worse. There is something particular about being told something devastating in perfect grammar. Diplomatic engagement is terminated pending internal review. The environment to which we were escorted constitutes an unacceptable exposure. The structure presented cannot be interpreted as anything other than a deliberate transmission of hostility. Elias kept reading. Your preservation of this construct represents an ongoing containment of concentrated experiential distress. We are unable to reconcile this with the intent of peaceful contact. He lowered the slate slightly, then raised it again. Your monument is not inert. It is active. The emotional field contained within it is continuous and unresolved. To enter it is to experience sustained states of fear, aggression, and terminal distress without cessation. We withdraw with the understanding that further interaction would require a fundamental reassessment of your species' relationship with its own constructs. The slate dimmed as the message ended. Silence. They think we did it on purpose, Mara said. Elias didn't answer, because that wasn't the part that concerned him most. They experienced something, he said instead. Mara folded her arms. Or they believe they did. No, Elias said, more firmly than he intended, and he didn't pull it back. That wasn't interpretation. That was reaction. There is a difference, and it matters. Then explain it, she said. He couldn't. Not yet. The debrief room was already active when they entered. Data streams covered the central display. Environmental readings, audio capture, structural integrity logs, electromagnetic scans, layered across multiple channels and telling the same story in every format. Dr. Ren Havek stood near the edge of the table, one hand resting against its surface, the other holding a stylus he had clearly forgotten to use. He was a small man with an intensity of focus that made him seem larger, the kind of researcher who has spent years being ignored for ideas that inconvenience established frameworks. He looked up as Elias entered. I reviewed everything we have, he said, without preamble. And? Elias asked. Nothing, Havek said. Mara exhaled sharply. Define nothing. No anomalies. No system fluctuations. No environmental changes. The ship is exactly what the records describe, cold, inactive, stable. No unusual acoustic frequencies, no electromagnetic variance, no thermal activity. Every measurable system says the same thing. A pause. Nothing happened. Elias stared at the data. That's not possible, Mara said. Havek looked at her. It depends on what you think possible includes. Elias turned slightly. You've studied their sensory models. For 3 years, yes. Mostly in isolation. It's not a popular area of research. Tell me what we're missing. Havek set the stylus down. Both hands on the table now. The posture of someone about to say something they have thought about too carefully to deliver casually. We've been using the wrong framework, he said. Everything we measured assumes interaction through conventional channels. Thermal, acoustic, electromagnetic. But the Gyklon's responses don't describe any of those. They described heat, Mara said. They described the experience of heat. Havek corrected, with the precision of someone for whom the distinction matters enormously. That is not the same thing. Elias felt the distinction land. Explain. Havek placed his hands flat on the table. In human terms, empathy is interpretive. We observe signals, expression, tone, behavior, physiological indicators, and we construct an internal model of another being's emotional state. The key word is construct. We build the model from data. We infer. Elias nodded. Inference. Yes. But what if their system doesn't infer? What if they don't model emotional states at all? Mara's eyes narrowed. You're suggesting direct perception. I'm suggesting, Havek said carefully, that they don't construct a model. They receive the state itself, not a representation of it. The thing itself. The room went quiet. As input, Elias said. As data, Havek replied. Unfiltered. Unmediated. The way we receive light. Not a description of light, but the light. Mara shook her head slightly. From what source? Havek looked back at the display. At the schematic of the ardent, rotating slowly in the center of the table. That, he said quietly, is the question. Elias's gaze moved to the schematic. They didn't react like this in the chamber, he said. Not even close. No, Havek agreed. In the chamber, they responded precisely and appropriately. Because the chamber was designed to contain nothing. No history. No accumulation. Neutral surfaces, neutral air. There was nothing to receive. Mara straightened. But on the ship, Havek said, there was 31 years of it. Of what? Mara pressed. Havek exhaled slowly. That vessel operated under extreme conditions for extended periods. High stress. Continuous threat environments. Dense crew occupancy. Closed systems with no exit. Which means it was filled, for over 3 decades, with people experiencing sustained emotional extremes. Fear. Aggression. Grief. Desperation. Survival. The fullness of what it means to be a human being in a situation that is trying to end you. Mara's voice was careful. That doesn't leave a residue. We don't think it does, Havek said. Elias felt something shift. Not a conclusion, a door opening. You're suggesting, he said slowly, that they weren't reading current conditions. Havek met his gaze. I'm suggesting they were reading accumulated ones. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences before it. Heavier. More specific. That's not how matter works, Mara said. It might not be how we think it works, Havek replied, with the quiet patience of someone who has considered this objection for 3 years. Elias looked at the schematic. At the highlighted section of corridor where Lyra had stopped, where she had touched the wall. The section labeled in the technical records as Section 7. the site of a plasma containment failure during active engagement on the ship's 18th year of deployment. A temperature spike of 340 degrees above the rated maximum, a pressure loss, an emergency seal that had held by a margin measured in seconds. 18 minutes before stabilization. The crew had survived. 7 of them had not. The heat, she had said. The pressure. The noise. It does not stop. Elias closed his eyes for a moment. Open them. What did she say? Havok asked. Her exact words. Elias didn't look at him. She said it doesn't stop. Nobody spoke. The implications settled slowly, the way large things settle, with a weight that arrives in stages. They weren't observing history, Mara said. No, Havok said. They were experiencing it. Yes. Elias felt the full weight of it arrive. Not as theory, not as hypothesis, as explanation. They thought we brought them there to show them something, he said. We did, Mara said. He nodded. Yes. And now he understood what they had actually seen. And, more importantly, what they had actually felt. The full analysis took 6 hours to compile and less than a minute to understand. By the time Elias returned to the briefing room, the data had been reorganized, less raw input now, more structured interpretation, the difference between evidence and meaning. Havok had mapped the Gyclone responses against location, not spatially, but chronologically. He displayed a new layer over the ship's schematic, specific sections highlighted in a gradient from faint amber to deep red. Where they paused after crossing the threshold, Havok said, marking the first point. Low-level response. The beginning of synchronization disruption. Still manageable. A second mark further in. Here, elevated reaction. Increasing instability. Still controlled, but effortful. And then the Section 7 corridor. Maximum response. Total loss of composure. Immediate withdrawal. Elias moved closer to the display. What happened in Section 7? Mara answered. Plasma containment failure. Year 18 of active deployment. Temperature spike of 340 degrees above rated maximum. An increase of roughly 52% above the ship's design threshold. Pressure loss in the affected section. Emergency seal engaged. 18 minutes before stabilization. 7 crew members did not survive the event. Elias nodded once. The heat, he said. Havok moved to another section, deeper along the corridor. And here, secondary engagement zone. Year 24. Close quarters conflict in a confined space. Significant casualties. Extended duration. The noise, Elias said. Mara's gaze shifted toward him. And the fear. The silence in the room was different now. Informed. Specific. Havok expanded the display, overlaying timeline data across the ship's full service record. They weren't reacting randomly, he said. They were following a gradient of accumulated intensity. The highest responses correlate precisely with the sites of the most extreme recorded events. Mara leaned forward. They experienced the ship as an environment, she said slowly. Not a structure. An environment composed of accumulated states, Havok confirmed. But the events were decades past, Mara pressed. The temperature in Section 7 right now is 4 degrees below ambient station baseline. It's one of the coldest sections of the ship. Havok looked at her steadily. For us, he said. Elias understood. For them there's no distinction, he said, between when it happened and where it happened. If their perception is tied to location rather than time, Havok began. Then the past isn't past, Mara finished. Quietly, like something she didn't want to say out loud once she'd said it. Elias felt the implications settle fully. They didn't walk into a museum, he said. No, Havok replied. They walked into an active field. Yes. A long breath. And we told them it was an honor, Mara said. No one responded. Elias reached forward and deactivated the overlay. The schematic returned to its neutral state. Clean. Simplified. Stripped of what they now knew about it. It looked harmless. He understood now that it had never been harmless, and that this had never been something they were capable of knowing on their own. They asked to understand us, he said. What produces our structures? What kind of mind builds what kind of world? And we showed them exactly that, Mara said. Yes, Elias replied. But not in the way we thought. Mara leaned against the table, her arms crossed loosely, looking at the deactivated display. From their perspective, she said slowly, we escorted them into a space saturated with sustained fear, aggression, and death. And then we presented it as something worthy of preservation. Something we maintain. Something we honor. That's not misinterpretation, Elias said. That's a logical conclusion, Havok added, quietly. Especially if you experienced it directly. Elias stood very still for a moment. Lyra's voice returned to him. The quality of it as it had changed in that corridor. The musical cadence beneath the words dissolving into something fractured and uneven. Her hand pressed against the metal. Her body rigid with something that did not belong to her. Something that was not hers, was not current, was not present in any sense that human instruments could measure, and yet was completely, overwhelmingly real to her. The fear. It is everywhere. They thought it was deliberate, he said. Mara didn't argue. Because what else would it be, she replied. Elias didn't answer. Because he understood something worse now. Something that sat below the misunderstanding and would remain after the misunderstanding was resolved. It hadn't been deliberate, but it also hadn't been accidental. It was something else. Something embedded. Something they had built without knowing what they were building, carried without knowing what they were carrying, and preserved without understanding what preservation meant to a species that could feel the weight of every moment ever lived in a place. Havok spoke carefully. There's one more implication. Elias looked at him. If their interpretation is correct, Havok said, they didn't just perceive the intensity of what happened in that ship. They may have perceived, the intent behind its preservation. Mara said it before Havok finished. They think we preserved it on purpose. Yes, Havok replied, and honored it. Mara's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. Which, in a way, we did. Elias said nothing. Because that part was true. They had preserved the Ardent. Maintained it. Respected it. Kept it as a record of what it had endured and what it had proven about the people who had served aboard it. Just not for the reason the Gyclons believed. To remember, Elias said. That's not how it reads to them, Mara said. No. He turned back to the display. Because they don't separate memory from experience. For them, preserving something like that, maintaining it, keeping it intact, showing it as a demonstration of who we are. Havok finished it. Means keeping it alive. The room went still. Elias rested his hands on the edge of the table. They asked us a question, he said. What kind of mind builds what kind of world, Mara said. And we answered it, Elias said. The answer was not the one they had intended to give. The broadcast did not come to them directly. That was the first indication of how seriously the Gyclons were treating what had happened. It was Mara who brought it in, not through official diplomatic channels, but through the wider network, the shared frequencies used between established interstellar civilizations for communications that one species intends all others to receive. Her expression, when she entered Elias's office, was controlled in the precise way it became when something had already moved beyond containment. They didn't send this to us, she said. Who did they send it to? She placed the data slate on his desk. Everyone else. He read it in silence. The message was longer than the termination notice. It followed the same pattern the Gyclons used in all formal communication. Context, reasoning, conclusion, but this time the scope was different. Much broader. There was no hostility in the language. No accusation. No anger. Or at least no anger that a human reader could easily identify. That made it worse. Precision in the absence of anger is more frightening than anger. The description of humanity was not what Elias expected. It was not framed as aggressive, not violent, not expansionist. Instead, something else. A species of profound and unregulated emotional imprinting, Elias read aloud. His voice, he noticed, was very even. They believe we embed emotional states into physical structures. Not intentionally, not as a weapon, but as a byproduct of how we exist. He kept reading. They described the Ardent not as a relic, but as an active construct. A concentration of sustained experiential extremes. A place where fear, aggression, and terminal stress existed not as historical records, but as present conditions. Constant, unresolved, accessible to any mind sensitive enough to receive them. They're issuing a caution, Mara said. Elias had reached that section. He read it carefully. Then again, to all recipient civilizations, he read, interaction with humanity should proceed with extreme care. Their structures may contain accumulated experiential states beyond tolerable thresholds for empathic species. A species capable of sustaining and preserving such concentrated states without apparent awareness presents an unknown risk profile. Their full capabilities, if ever intentionally directed, cannot be accurately modeled. He set the slate down. How many received it, he asked. 43 confirmed civilizations, Mara said, as of this morning. And how many of those have we made contact with? 11. He absorbed that. The other 32, he said, will hear about us before they ever meet us. Yes. Our introduction is already written, he said. And not by us. Mara remained where she was. The kind of stillness that is not calm, but the management of something that is not calm. They think we don't understand what we are, Elias said. Mara tilted her head slightly. Do we? He didn't answer. Because the question was different now than it had been when the meeting was a successful first contact, and the only mystery was a soft sound made at precisely the right moment. They believe we're capable of something we don't even recognize, Mara continued. That we can take emotional extremes and fix them into physical reality. That we carry them forward, embedded in what we build. Elias's eyes moved to the viewport. The station's exterior lights traced faint lines across the darkness, outlining structures that extended far beyond what could be seen at once. Structures built over decades by people working under pressure, working with what was available, working past the point where the materials should have held. They're not entirely wrong, he said. Mara frowned. Explain. He turned his head just enough to look at her. We build under pressure. We endure conditions that should break us. And we don't discard those experiences. We carry them forward. Into what we make. Into how we make it. Into what we keep and what we call worth keeping. Mara considered that. That's not the same as what they described. No, Elias agreed. It's not. He repeated it. And this time, with slightly less certainty. Elias, Mara said carefully. If even part of their interpretation is correct, then we've been leaving something behind, he said. In everything we build, everything we preserve, every structure we maintain as a record of what we survived and what we refuse to lose. The words settled into the room. And we've never noticed, Mara said. Elias turned back to the viewport. Far below, along one of the older docking arms, the Ardent rested exactly where it had been. Unchanged. Silent. Permanent in the way that things become permanent when no one has decided to end them. They noticed, he said quietly. Mara followed his gaze. Yes, she said. They did. The station lights shifted slightly as the system cycled into the next segment of its artificial day. Everything continued. Operations. Traffic. The ordinary machinery of a civilization that has never had to think of itself from the outside before. And somewhere across the distances between stars, across 43 worlds where minds worked in ways that humanity had barely begun to understand, 43 civilizations were looking at humanity for the first time through a lens that had been made for them by someone else. A lens shaped by the experience of a single room in a single old ship on a single afternoon. A lens shaped by fear. By caution, by something that came very close to awe. Elias stood in the silence of his office and watched the light move slowly across the dark. And for the first time since any of this had begun, he found himself wondering not what the Gyclons thought of humanity, but whether they were right. Whether the thing they had felt in that corridor, pressing out through the walls like heat through old metal, whether that was something alien to human nature, something unusual, something to be explained away. Or whether it was simply what we have always been, a species that burns so brightly and so completely that the fire doesn't go out when we do, that we leave something of ourselves in everything we build, that our buildings remember us, and that some minds we are only beginning to meet, can hear them. He stood there a long time, listening to a ship he could not hear, wondering what it was saying.